Hi, my name is Joe, and welcome to my YouTube channel. And in this book review, I'm going to be discussing Inside the Lion's Den by Ken Shamrock and Richard Hanner. Ken Shamrock is a pioneer in mixed martial arts. He originally fought in the Pancrase organization, but he became most famous fighting in early UFC events. And he's also a professional wrestler, so a lot of people might know him from that. Richard Hanner, from what I've been able to dig up between Facebook and LinkedIn, he graduated from Stanford University and he worked in the newspaper industry in California, both in Stockton and Lodi and probably some other places. Can't confirm. Don't take my word for that. But last thing that was listed as far as employment on his LinkedIn was self-employed. And anyway, the book itself is largely an overview of, it's very biographical concerning Ken Shamrock for, I'd say, roughly 60 to 70%, and then the last part of the book talks more about the techniques of very early MMA, what at that time would have been called, extreme fighting or ultimate fighting, trademark, patent pending, or no holds barred. These days we might also use the term vale tudo, although that wasn't very common outside of Brazil at the time. So when we get to the techniques, you'll see things like, this is how to strike someone when you're not wearing gloves. Anyway, it follows him in the build-up to UFC 9. So during the biographical section, we'll get a chapter that's set, currently leading up to that fight, his super fight with Dan Severn. And we will alternate chapters that are on that with chapters that go into Shamrock's history. And those chapters are largely chronological, going from when he was a kid, building up to, when he first started fighting in the first few UFC events. The bulk of it is about the fights, though, the early UFC stuff. So, you'll get to see from his perspective what, the matches with guys like Patrick Smith and Royce Gracie and those other early pioneers were like. When we get to the technical section, a lot of it is based off of catch wrestling / shoot wrestling. Again, he learned submissions. Shamrock himself had an amateur background. He wasn't a highly decorated amateur wrestler, but according to him, he was hit to state. Although, frankly, I'm not sure if that was addressed in this book. It just something I picked up. So he had a really solid amateur background. He picked up submissions when he went to Japan. To give a brief overview of that, he broke into professional wrestling. Then Dean Malenko, who's, some people might know him. He reached some fame during the mid to late 90s in the US. He was another professional wrestler who was like, hey, your style would really work with this shoot style. And it was still matches with predetermined outcomes, but the difference was it was more like submission grappling sparring, and they applied the holds with more intent than you would see in the US, and they were more realistic. So they learned legitimate stuff, like, the Juji Gatame style armbar, toe holds, heel hooks, knee bars, an assortment of chokes. And then he got big in the US, and then ultimately went back to professional wrestling. That's actually where the biographical section of the book ends, when he makes that transition back to pro wrestling. Um, and then, of course, he went back and forth between mixed martial arts and pro wrestling for a little while again. Um, so the submissions he learned, he actually picked up in Japan from guys like Fujiwara. Apparently, Karl Gotch was sort of part of that mix, although I don't know if he picked them up directly from him. He does credit guys like Masakatsu Funaki and Minoru Suzuki with helping him in his submission journey. But because that type of wrestling, that lineage of submissions, came from the likes of, Luthez, Karl Gotch, Billy Robinson, probably more people. Those are the ones these days that are sort of notable for that. So it's a very scrambly style. It's based on a lot of movement compared to the more methodical Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu type of grappling. What's interesting in this book, when it breaks down the techniques, there is a section on stand-up. It's like, here's how to throw a punch, basically, and a kick. And I think there's only like one or two like dedicated takedowns. You do see in the submission section there are basically ways to fall into a leg lock or roll into a leg lock. So I guess because you're moving the guy from the feet to the floor, that those could technically count as takedowns, but they're largely about snagging the submissions. The stand-up section also includes a neck crank. I think maybe a guillotine. I'd have to go back and check, but what's called the stocks neck crank, which is similar mechanically, at least to the person it's being applied to a full Nelson. So your arms are being pushed out behind you, your head is being forced forward. But you're also doing it while the guy's head's under your armpits and you're sort of like stretching his arms with your arms. So it'll talk a little bit about that, then it'll move into chokes, which I think it pretty much covers rear naked choke, shoulder choke, aka arm triangle, and the leg triangle choke. Then it'll go into arm locks. All the arm locks, interestingly, are the Juji Gatame style. I'm not sure Shamrock ever won a fight with that style of arm lock, so it's sort of interesting it's included in here. And then he gets into the leg lock section, and there's a pretty wide variety with those. Locks to the knee, locks to the ankles. Some that have become very popular, and some that today you won't see a whole lot of. But it's an interesting section. You're also going to get chapters on things like physical fitness and nutrition. You're going to get actually a variety of that. It's very much about being a good athlete. So you'll get everything from body weight exercises like Hindu squats to, guy, if you're a fighter, you should do bench press because it'll give you a strong upper body, to things like agility drills, like, hopping over training partners or jump ropes. I don't mean rope skipping. I mean somebody stretching out the rope and you're hopping over it, then ducking under it, coming back through. So some interesting full body agility drills. I think, I don't know if we see enough of that in modern combat sports, but it sort of makes sense to have those around. It does include sections on ground positioning, but these are going to sort of, if you are familiar with either judo or Brazilian jiu-jitsu groundwork, this is going to be sort of distinct from that. And some of these positions I think could sort of be added in these days. It's got kind of a lot of ways to address someone who is belly down or turtled up. And you don't see a whole lot of that. You know, the general thing in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is you're either going to, you know, isolate an arm and get a crucifix position, or you're going to try to open the guy up and dig your hooks in and take his back. So I think it's interesting that we have these other perspectives on how to address that position. There's also a little bit on fight preparation and pre-fight psychology. You know, Shamrock gives his rituals, for instance, on how he gets into fighting mindset. You know, like, for instance, he says he will watch something like Braveheart. You know, this was the 90s when it came out. And, you know, get himself into, you know, I'm a warrior, I'm going to war sort of mindset through that. You know, there are other factors that they talk about as well, but, you know, that one sticks out. From a technical perspective, the bottom grappling is sort of garbage. It is based very much on, you know, the Japanese shoot fighting style. So it's nowhere near as methodical as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in comparison, but rather it's based a lot on creating scrambles. Like, I think his answer for getting out of the mount was basically to, you know, sort of roll backwards. You know, it's not as systematic as some more modern grappling. So it is an interesting snapshot of like that particular fighting style and what was going around in 1997 when the book was published. But it, to someone with a modern eye, it comes, the pros, I think it's a really good balance between an entertaining story of Ken Shamrock's life and here are some martial arts techniques. The Richard Hanner, who's, you know, very obviously it's his voice through the biographical section. He does a good job of making this Ken Shamrock's story. You know, he makes him look like $1 million. So it's definitely entertaining from that perspective. I think from a historical perspective, I enjoy seeing, you know, what at the time was like, you know, revolutionary, cutting edge, no holds barred style fighting. You know, there wasn't a whole lot of that information out there at the time. You know, and again, addressing things like, you know, if you're in a guy's guard and you're fighting bare knuckle, you want to punch him with this knuckle. So, you know, it'll really dig into his ribs. You know, this is something that's not going to come up when you're wearing gloves, for instance. It's going to be harder to, you know, isolate a particular knuckle to just, you know, punch a guy in the ribs forever with, because there were also no or few time limits at the time. So that strategy really fits in for that sort of fighting, and we just don't see that anymore. And I also think the parts on conditioning are pretty good. As far as the cons go, there are a few inaccuracies. The number of the UFC is wrong. I mean, they're getting it in, they're using Roman numerals. So I think they, instead of being UFC 9, it's like UFC 11 or something like that. They also talk about Hoist choking Shamrock with the gi. It didn't happen. You know, it's The announcers thought so at the time. Shamrock has maintained to this day that Hoist choked him with the gi. You can get photos. There are pictures online where it clearly shows he wasn't choking him with, he was using a rear naked choke. This only perpetuates that inaccuracy. Besides that, one of my personal complaints is that there isn't a lot in the way of takedowns. And it's interesting because, again, Ken Shamrock started off in wrestling. And I think in particular, when you look at his early mixed martial arts career, he really liked his body lock takedowns. He didn't really shoot for takedowns a whole lot. So the one takedown presented is a double leg. And, this guy who could be showing us all these body lock takedowns and trips isn't. So that was a bit disappointing. And on top of that, as I mentioned, some of the ground stuff, particularly like the bottom game stuff, is just sort of primitive and outdated by today's standards. So with that being said, who would I recommend this to? First things first, if you are a Ken Shamrock fan, or you are nostalgic for the old days of mixed martial arts, the early pioneer days, I'd almost say that this is a must-have. Even, despite some of the inaccuracies when it comes to some of the facts, despite some of the outdated techniques, if you're getting it for the history or for the story, then you don't need to worry about the technical section. If you are interested in techniques, it's a little hard for me to recommend it because at this point, we have much better resources for, anything in here. Whether it's, there's a book out there called the Juji Gatame Encyclopedia. If you want to learn how to do an arm lock, you can get that one. If you want to know about leg locks, John Danaher, coach of the Danaher Death Squad, has a series out there on leg locks that you can buy at BJJ Fanatics. In other words, I can't really recommend this for the techniques, except as that sort of historical snapshot of what was, the new hotness back in 1997. So, technique-wise, you can do better with anything published in the last 10 or 15 years. So I guess primarily I would recommend it to someone who's got more of an eye toward the history of early mixed martial arts, or again, just a fan of Ken Shamrock. So that's it for this review. I've had this book for years. I really enjoyed it. It actually was my intro into doing Hindu squats as well as the heel hook. So on a personal nostalgic level, I appreciate, the stuff that I got from reading this book, way back in like 2000, 2001 when I first, came across it. So in that respect, I enjoy reviewing a book that I've gone through several times. And I hope some of that excitement got through in spite of some of my criticisms of it. And anyway, we'll see you next week. Thank you very much.